Hi, my name's Dr. Sarah Mollard. I'm from the Head Heart's Hand project, a climate resilience project in the mid-north coast of New South Wales. Welcome to our webinar, Through Nature to Nurture, exploring the mental health impacts of climate change and how nature-based interventions can be part of the solution. First, we're going to hear from Dr. Jo Longman from the University of Sydney, telling us about her research into the mental health impacts of climate change and into community resilience following natural disasters. Then from Dr. Dimity Williams from Doctors for the Environment Australia about nature-based interventions and the role that they can play for human health and well-being. And then finally, we're going to join a conversation with some local practitioners to hear about their experiences. Catherine Ullman and Jackie Leach from the Nature School, Port Macquarie, Andrew Lord from Blueprint Life Coaching, and Cherie Levy, a psychologist from the northern New South Wales coast. I hope you enjoy our webinar.
So I just want, before I go any further, to say really what I mean by resilience, because it's such an overused term. So in this presentation, I'm talking about the resilience to the mental health impacts of climate change rather than other sorts of resilience. But I'll talk a little bit later on about some definitions of resilience. Okay. So in the presentation, I'm going to give a little bit of background to the study that we've been doing, which has been around identifying mental health impacts of climate change and resilience in rural communities, to talk about the aims of the study, the methods we used, the results around mental health impacts of climate change, a typology that we've developed of those impacts, and to talk a bit about resilience. But before I go further, I just want to say a bit more about being a rural researcher. So this is a publication from the Climate Council from 2016, and it really works. It really does articulate the greater disadvantage that's experienced by rural communities and how that's going to be exacerbated by climate change. So the risks posed by climate change to health, including mental health, security, environmental assets and economy, threaten to exacerbate many of the social, economic and health inequalities that are already experienced by those who are in rural areas. Okay, so in order to talk about the current study, I want to go back a little bit. Sarah said in my introduction about the flood study that we did. I don't know if people remember the catastrophic flooding in the Northern Rivers in sort of late March, early April 2017, but we did quite a substantial study at that point where we looked at the mental health of the community 6 months following the floods. And that study showed, not surprisingly, a very clear association between flood exposure and negative mental health outcomes like probable anxiety, depression, PTSD, suicidal ideation, and still being distressed about the flood 6 months on. And some subpopulations had higher risk of negative mental health outcomes, including respondents who were socioeconomically disadvantaged and our Aboriginal respondents. That study also did show that individual and community resilience was associated in general with less risk of negative mental health outcomes. And that supports previous research really around the role of resilience, I guess. So our study around the flood and a few other Australian studies like it give some flavour about the kinds of mental health impacts, but they don't really give the full scope, if you like. So this project that I'm going to tell you about now really aimed to identify the broad range of mental health impacts of climate change, particularly from the rural Australian literature, and to develop a typology of those impacts. And then finally, to try and understand how resilience to the mental health impacts of climate change might be enhanced in rural communities. So a typology, what is it and why do we need it? So really, it's just a mechanism of classifying this big list of the mental health impacts according to general categories. And the reason it's helpful to have something like a typology is that really without it, our capacity to develop policy and pathways for increasing adaptability and resilience is compromised. So how we went about this work was to run a rapid scoping review, which had these 5 key steps: identifying the research question, finding the papers, selecting the studies, charting the data, and then collecting, summarising and reporting what we found in the studies. Sorry, I should just go back and tell you that what I'm going to show you next comes from 85 papers. Almost all of those are Australian. About half of them are rural, and they're focused on adults. There is some research, not very much, around children and adolescents, but what I'm going to show you here is around adults. And what's good about doing a scoping review is it's quite a quick way of gathering together what's out there in the published literature. And it gives you a mechanism for really identifying some sort of key concepts that are out there. So it's helpful for us in developing the typology. I'll talk about that in a minute. So here are some of the mental health impacts of climate change. This is just a selection from quite a long list of things that occur in the typology. So there are a number of mood disorders like post-traumatic stress, depression and anxiety. There's suicidality. There's exacerbation of pre-existing acute mental illness. So there's some interesting research around people experiencing mental illness like schizophrenia and what happens to them in heat waves, how that's exacerbated by being in heat. There's all kinds of different sorts of distress, fear, anger, sadness, hopelessness, frustration. And also distress for the potential and actual losses of others. So it's not just about individuals' distress about what's happening to them personally. And then over on the right-hand side here, there's this generalized climate anxiety, also known as eco-anxiety. There's things like loss of identity, knowledge and confidence, as well as belonging and place. And then some impacts that are very much at the community level. So corrosion of social foundation because of things happening around climate change, and challenges to traditional ways of life, and therefore decreased community well-being. In the green at the bottom here, there are a couple of positive mental health impacts that the literature covers, things like post-traumatic growth and compassion. So I want to just kind of show how it's not all negative mental health impacts. So what you can see from this really are that the mental health impacts are many and varied. They're both negative as well as positive. And some populations, again, I want to stress, some populations are especially vulnerable to those impacts. And all of this really underscores the importance of a focus on mental health in any efforts around addressing the impacts of climate change. So in terms of that typology, or that list rather, we took that list to 5 Zoom workshops. So we've only just finished running, like literally a couple of weeks ago. And we had 36 participants across 5 Zoom workshops all in rural New South Wales. We had a couple of workshops in Lismore, focused on Lismore, a couple that were focused on Broken Hill, and a workshop that was based around Orange. And we had a huge variety of people taking part. We had local and state government employees, we had other researchers, we had farmers, we had psychologists, we had volunteers from community groups, we had mental health service providers, land care coordinators, all sorts of people came. So it's a really broad mix of people that came to the workshops. And quite broadly, they agreed with what was in that list that I've just showed you, plus the rest of it. And they added some nuance and a few additional things. So we're working at the moment in producing our kind of next draft, if you like. So I'm just going to show you a screenshot of the typology. So down the left here is, you'll recognise this list of the mental health impacts. It goes on for several pages, this typology. This is just the first page. But in doing this work and pulling things together, we discern 3 distinct pathways by which climate change is impacting on mental health. So firstly, there's a direct pathway, and that's mental health being directly impacted, usually from something like a severe weather-related event. So for example, post-traumatic stress associated with fleeing from a bushfire, for example. And the impacts from that may be actually very long lasting. We're not quite sure in the research literature how long the tail is in terms of how long the impacts last, but we know for some people it can be years. So secondly, there's this more distal pathway where the impacts are less direct. So you don't necessarily have to have been involved in something like an extreme weather event to experience mental health impacts from it. So you might not necessarily have to be in a bushfire, but you might be extremely distressed by watching the footage of the bushfires on the television, for example, and you may have extreme concern for others. So mental health impacts are not limited to those people who are directly harmed by an event, and they're also not necessarily immediate. So in the flood study, for example, we had a lot of people expressing distress because following the floods, there were huge amounts of rubbish piled up on the side of the streets for several weeks, and that was extremely distressing. And then finally, there's this third pathway, this what we've called generalized climate anxiety, sometimes called eco-anxiety. It has many different names. And again, the mental health impacts here are not limited to those directly harmed by an event. This is a much broader thing that's a concern about the health of the planet and concern for the future. So this typology, these kind of three pathways, I think, illustrate that there are many similarities in mental health impacts across those three pathways, and shows that mental health impacts are not limited to those who are directly harmed by an event. It also highlights, importantly, that third main pathway, the generalized climate anxiety. And certainly at the workshops, it was really interesting. At the workshops, participants described how, in their experience, there's really not much space out there for having discussions about how you're feeling about climate change and about eco-anxiety. There's not really a huge space for that kind of work. So in summary, the mental health impacts of climate change are many and varied. They're positive as well as negative, and they are immediate and longer term. You don't have to be directly impacted to be affected, and all of that underscores the importance of a focus on mental health in any efforts to address climate change impacts. There seem to be these three pathways: a direct, a distal, and a generalized climate anxiety pathway, and some populations are more vulnerable to those mental health impacts than others. Okay, so in the second part of this presentation, I'm only going to talk for another 5 or 10 minutes. I'm going to talk about the link between mental health and resilience. So as you've seen from the typology, the mental health impacts of climate change are many and varied, and are negative in the main. So things like anxiety, post-traumatic stress, depression, etc. And there is evidence that higher levels of resilience are associated with positive mental health outcomes. So for example, in the flood study that I've already talked about, I described that we were able to show that in general, respondents who had higher amounts of individual and community resilience had better mental health outcomes than people with lower levels of resilience. And that does fit in with other research studies. However, that is an oversimplification. So first of all, there's really quite a lot of complexity around the definition and measuring of resilience and how that works. And some forms of resilience building that I'm going to go on and talk about may have negative consequences for some populations. For example, they might reinforce exclusive social identity to the detriment of others who are not in that shared space or group. So you can imagine a group of people getting together who have a shared interest. That group may inadvertently exclude others. And so what that means is that programs or activities or supports or services that are fundamentally aiming to build resilience need to consider their inclusivity to different groups, and also that different kinds of resilience building that target different aspects of resilience, they might be needed for different groups in the population. It's definitely not a one-size-fits-all situation. So just a tiny bit now about what do I mean by resilience. We've got this sort of overarching concept of resilience, and then within that community resilience, and within that individual resilience. So as an overarching definition, here's a definition from the IPCC from 2014 that's around the capacity of social, economic and environmental systems to cope with a hazardous event, a trend or disturbance, responding or reorganizing in ways that maintain their essential function, identity and structure, while also maintaining the capacity for adaptation, learning and transformation. So here's a definition of community resilience. So the existence, development and engagement of community resources by community members to thrive in an environment characterized by change, uncertainty, unpredictability and surprise. And we know that community resilience is associated with optimism, being socially connected and also learning from the past. I'm going to talk about the being socially connected in a moment. So I just want to talk a little bit now about individual resilience. So there is one useful construct, which is this idea of social capital, this construct that you can measure at an individual level. And this is based on some work by Helen Berry and Welsh, going back from 2010, which looks at social capital as having two elements, if you like, a community participation element that's about what people do, and a personal social cohesion element, which is more about what people feel. And the model is that community participation impacts positively on a personal social cohesion, and that impacts positively on people's mental health. So by community participation, we mean things like informal social connections, social media connections, civic engagement, and also people's perceptions of participating, whether they get some enjoyment from participating. And by personal social cohesion, we mean feelings of belonging, trusting others, and optimism. So higher levels of social capital are associated with a lower risk of the kinds of negative mental health outcomes that I've described in those earlier slides. And that includes amongst vulnerable communities. So it's what people do part, really, that's potentially the space for programs or activities or strategies or whatever that can help improve people's mental health or bolster up their mental health in the face of climate change. But I do want to acknowledge at this point that community participation isn't the only way to do that. And the whole notion of feeling of belonging and feeling networked can also, and being connected, can also fundamentally be about place and about the role of nature. And that's what we're going to hear about from the other speakers today. Okay, so one of the things we did on our scoping review was have a look at the grey literature. So basically what's on the internet about activities or events or projects or strategies that aim to increase resilience to the mental health impacts of climate change in rural Australia. And what we found is there's not very much, interestingly, that's written that you can access. So we did look for PDFs, which may have limited the sorts of scope of things that we found. But nevertheless, what we did find fall into these kind of 6 categories. So there's an event category, which is about public events that might restore or create new social connections. There's group activities like land care, tree planting, etc. There's self-help and support materials, and here's a screenshot of a great publication from Psychology for a Safe Climate, which is called Coping with Climate Change Distress. There's peer support, like sharing food, etc., having cups of tea with neighbours. There's emergency services and organisational activities and support. So, for example, the Hotspots Fire Project, which is an RFS and Nature Conservation Council community engagement programme that's about fire management skills. And finally, some measures that address the psychosocial impacts of climate change, like mental health first aid training. So I just want to go back to our workshops, our Zoom workshops that we ran, and give you a tiny bit of feedback from those workshops. At those events, we asked the community to think about the kinds of events that they knew about that were going on locally, and to give some priorities to those events. And these are the sorts of things that they said. They talked about the absolutely central nature of it having to be community-led, working together and working really hard to find common ground and doing things that are inclusive, and needing perspectives from a wide range of different people. They talked about action as an antidote to despair, They talked about the importance of being heard and having some channels for expression. And they also talked about sustainable local support. The issue of, fly in, fly out type of activities or actions or programs or projects not being helpful. And also that constant pressure to innovate. That you can't set something up that's actually working and then carry on doing that. In order to continue funding something, you actually have to change what you're doing and innovate. So in summary then, from that bit of my presentation, there's an association between resilience and positive mental health outcomes. But we do have significant gaps in our knowledge at the moment and understanding about what's happening in rural local contexts, and also in particular what's effective for whom and where and under what circumstances and why. So in our scoping review, we only actually found 3 projects that had been formally evaluated. So that puts us in a position where we don't know very much about what's working for whom and why. So they're my references, and I just want to say thank you again for inviting me here, and they're my contact details. I'm very willing for people to contact me directly. In fact, I'd be delighted to hear from people. So that's my email address and my phone number. So thank you.
Thank you so much, Jo. You've really done a great job of setting the scene for us tonight about these ideas around the climate change mental health impacts, but also around what we can do about them to develop community mental health resilience. And there's a real standout there for me around those ideas of community participation and also of place playing a role in those feelings of belonging and connection and the positive benefits that we can get from them. And I really feel like we're going to be seeing those things come together as we talk with our community panelists later in the evening. So now if we perhaps bring in Dimity to the conversation, she's going to be sharing us a little bit about some of the ideas that we have around available to us around the nature-based mental health and wellbeing interventions and how connecting with nature is good for our mental health. Over to you, Dimity.
Okay, is that screen worked okay? You can hear me all right? Yep, great. Oh, well, thank you very much. I'm really thrilled to be here with you all. So I wanted to begin, of course, by acknowledging traditional owners. I'm on Wurundjeri country down here in Victoria, but of course we're all on Aboriginal land, which of course is unceded. And I really feel like I like to start my talks by, I was particularly talking about nature and wellbeing, by first just highlighting that First Nations people have this really inherent understanding of the reciprocal nature between health and wellbeing and looking after country. And so I like to share a little story because I've had some great learning experiences over my life. And this is just a brief story of my oldest son, Ben here, who's now 22 actually. So this is quite some time ago. And he's with a man called Willie Gordon who's a Ngunnawara elder up north of Cooktown. And he'd taken us out on country. So we walked through this beautiful woodland and up an escarpment. And of course, we're from Melbourne, so we were pretty exhausted by the time we got up the top with the heat. And we paused to have a drink, and we all had a drink. And then when we finished our drink, Willie pointed out a little lizard on the ground, which of course we hadn't noticed, and turned to my oldest son and said, well, you know, we've all had a drink. Do you think maybe the lizard would like a drink? And well, Ben said, oh, I guess so. And Willie said, well, maybe you could give him a drink. And Ben wasn't really sure how to go about that. So Willie explained that, you know, if you picked up a leaf and you put a bit of your water in the leaf and put it on the ground, well, the lizard will have a drink. So, you know, very carefully, Ben did put a little bit of water into the leaf and put it on the ground near the lizard. And of course, the lizard scurried over and drank from the leaf. And for me, that was just, for all of us, actually, it was a great learning of really paying attention to the natural world around us, but also this sense of stewardship and connection, and this idea that if we look after the natural world around us, it in turn will look after us. So I think for that's something that still resonates for me now, and I've really learned a lot about slowing down and paying attention, and then that element of care and looking after, which I guess is a little bit of that connection to place that perhaps Jo was talking about. That's particularly relevant here in Melbourne, as we've just come out of very prolonged lockdown, and personally I found a great deal of relief from just being able to get out, because we couldn't go very far, of course, but going out and connecting with just the local nature. It's always nearby. Okay. So I just thought I'd mention a little bit about my background, because we're talking about climate anxiety or distress. And I'm someone who's been, obviously rural communities are very high risk, and people who've been affected directly by fires. But I think another huge group of people who've been campaigning for change for decades, talking about climate action and trying to engage, with politicians and through civil society, and not seeing action. And that can have been quite a distressing thing, but also this sense of community and coming together with others. So there's sort of this development of some positives out of that experience as well. And there's a little photo there of some of my colleagues from Doctors for the Environment as well. That was back in, I think, 2007, actually. And the next slide is quite alike too. So my youngest son's bottom right corner, who's just finished year 12, so he's now 18. So he was in preschool then. And Peter Costello was our federal member, and he was the treasurer at the time. And so we had these great sort of colourful community events to try and get him to do something. And he actually said in a media interview around that time, well, by 2030, we'll all be dead anyway. And of course, when, it's not looking like we're all going to be dead by 2030, but, we've just lived through horrific bushfires throughout the country. And so it's quite frustrating to be witnessing these sort of events coming through when it's something that we've been talking about for a long time. So I think there's a lot of people in the community who are experiencing these psychological distress, whether or not they're directly impacted by severe weather events or not. So there's this sort of really important relationship between our health and our natural environment. So looking at what I often refer to as the dark side, so we've got the health impacts of climate change. Climate change has been described as the biggest public health threat we're facing this century. I think that's quite a well-known concept now. But of course, it's not the only thing. There's also air pollution, plastic pollution, loss of biodiversity, and the extinction crisis that we're facing. And even this COVID pandemic, which is what we call a zoonosis. So it's a new type of infection which has jumped from one species to another and then into affect humans. And it's thought that arose from these wet markets in China, which is where animals who normally would be in completely different ecosystems are pushed together in these abnormal situations. So there's lots of people around, there's lots of blood and secretions, and it's a perfect environment for these new viruses to jump across. So, through our actions of, fragmenting the natural lands, the natural ecosystems, we are inadvertently creating these pandemics and affecting our health. So there's this really complex relationship between human health and the natural environment. On the positive side, which is where I like to spend a lot of my time now, is talking about how nature supports wellbeing. So there's these foundations of health. So the natural world provides us with clean water and air, healthy soils in which to grow our food, rich biodiversity, and a stable climate. More than half the medicines we use today have come from nature, and we're continuing to find new agents all the time. And of course, our food comes from nature. But what I wanted to focus on specifically tonight was how just simply spending time in nature or connecting to nature in itself is beneficial for human health. And I think this is a really important point for a couple of reasons. Firstly, of course, because We want to prevent, time spent in nature helps to prevent and also cure or be part of the therapeutic toolkit for many of our lifestyle-related modern health problems, mental health problems being chief amongst them. But it also helps to reframe nature as being essential for health, which is something that many politicians and other community leaders aren't so much aware of. The natural world's often been seen as something from which we can take, through extractive industries like logging or mining, and not so much for, providing us with a therapeutic place in which to recover. I just want to briefly mention what I see as a huge challenge, which is the disconnection from nature. And so I've used this Lunig cartoon to highlight that. So you can see the miracle of spring. A man watches a football match on his device. So, you can take people out, they can be in the most beautiful natural environment, but if they're just looking at their screen, they're not really going to get any of those benefits. So addressing this disconnection from nature, I think, is really important. And I think if we can, again, highlight the therapeutic benefit for people of being outside in nature, that is just as important for us as getting 8 hours sleep a night or having our 5 serves of veggies, 2 serves of fruit a day. Getting a certain amount of time out in nature is just fundamentally important for our health. So there's now a strong evidence base to support the assertion that nature connection and contact can support our physical, mental and emotional health. And this can range from a whole range of experiences. So you can simply be just looking out a window onto a view of nature. So studies have found that looking at it on a natural view helps patients recover more quickly from surgery, require fewer medications, and so go home sooner. Listening to natural sounds or looking at natural imagery also helps reduce distress for patients in hospital. And so there's this range of benefits from just these simple looking out onto nature or looking at a view, right through to deeper immersion, like going on a multi-day bushwalk or camping. But it seems that having water involved is extra good, as is the richer the biodiversity of the environment you're in. So being on a flat green sports oval is not going to be as beneficial as perhaps stepping into a forest or walking along an ocean beach. And particularly important if we're engaging multiple senses. Just this image of people walking through a park. Obviously, the physical benefits of doing that are, physical exercise, which helps to strengthen our bones and our muscles. It's good for our balance and proprioception. Improves our vision, because when we're out in nature, we're tending to look out into the distance as well as at objects close to us, as opposed to just staring at a screen, which is a fixed distance away. When you're outside, you're getting healthy vitamin D, which of course we know is important for our mood and also for developing strong bones and muscles. As far as mental health benefits go, people taking a walk through a park or a green space have less depressive rumination than if they walked alongside a busy road. Urban areas with more greenness have lower crime rates and greater social connectivity. And children with more nature-rich playgrounds tend to be able to focus better when they come back into class. And various studies have found that children with attentional problems have fewer symptoms after a walk, again, through a park, as opposed to walking through a shopping strip. And then we can go through to getting into a forest, and where there's lots of a variety of plants and animals around. And that has a really deep therapeutic benefit, lowering blood pressure and heart rate, reducing levels of the stress hormone cortisol in the body, and also reducing feelings of stress. And then the multi-day bushwalk has been shown to help improve cognitive outcomes like creativity and problem solving. So many benefits, and for people in rural areas, but also for people in cities. There are a few different theories of how this time in nature might support well-being. So these are sort of 3 of the main ones. So there's the biophilia hypothesis, which some of you may have heard of, which was described by E.O. Wilson. And this is that we've got this inherent or inbuilt love of nature because, you know, we evolved over millennia out in nature, and this move inside to sit down and stare at a screen is a really new thing for evolutionary point of view. So our brains just aren't used to it. So we really like being outside. The stress reduction theory, which posits that out in nature there's just less stress, so we don't have, you know, emails pinging in and loud sounds and the harsh sights and noises of being in a city. So it's just a more relaxing place to be out in nature. And the final one is attention restoration theory, which is that nature holds our attention effortlessly, which allows us to recover from mental fatigue. So the different aspects of that are just, again, being away from that stressful environment, provides things that might provoke our sense of wonder or fascination, and helps to put life into perspective as we feel, you know, part of a small part of a whole, rather than that everything's just all about us. But obviously more work's being done on exactly how the mechanism for the mental health benefits for being out in nature. Now, I just thought I'd go through a few examples for practice. So, firstly, as I mentioned before, just having patients look out onto a view is beneficial. So some hospitals are taking that into their design. The new Royal Children's Hospital here in Melbourne was designed so that 90% of patients' rooms actually look out onto the surrounding Royal Park, because it was felt this was going to be beneficial for patients. And many hospitals are starting to bring in natural imagery and also gardens. I've got some nice photos here from Stephen Wells at the Royal Talbot Hospital here in Melbourne. It's a rehabilitation hospital, so people who've had severe spinal cord or brain injury, so people who are in hospital for a long time. Stephen is a nurse and a horticultural therapist, and he's also a garden designer. So you can see the before and the after photos of the gardens that he's created in the hospital. And the gardens are for patients and for staff and for visitors. And he engages them in the therapeutic horticulture in gardening activities. So obviously these are important for developing, improving patients' fine and gross motor skills, but also, you know, enables them to be caring for something rather than simply being in care, which many patients who are in hospital for a long time feel. And also it provides a beautiful space for people coming to visit loved ones who might be really suffering a lot of grief at what's happened to their partner or their family member. Recently, Stephen, I was speaking to him and he was talking about how the gardens, they utilise the gardens for nursing staff who, you know, the younger nurses throughout the pandemic were finding it extremely stressful coming to work. And so they decided that the last hour of each shift, they would be sent down to the garden to be with Stephen, and he would sort of facilitate them having a sort of a mindful, interactive and engaged experience just out in the garden. And that really helped them to cope with the stress of that time of coming to work during the pandemic. So there's some really beautiful programs that can take place in hospitals. Certainly within general practice, you know, bringing plants into consulting rooms is important. I think it improves the air quality, so removes toxins from the air, increases oxygen concentration and humidity, which is important for people with respiratory problems, but also helps, you know, elevate mood and makes people generally feel better. And I think, you know, perhaps it's something for us to think about clinically, you know, having plants or fish tanks or natural imagery in waiting rooms, as opposed to perhaps having a TV screen on, which is showing the, you know, the latest horrific news of the day, which I don't think is at all therapeutic for people. There's a few examples here of community programs. The Active in Parks program was something that ran in Melbourne from about 2010 for quite a few years, and it was a collaboration between the Primary Health Network and local parks and gardens, and it involved a whole suite of different interventions. So some of them were maternal and child health nurses taking new mothers groups. Instead of running them in the community health centre, they were run in local parks and playgrounds, so that the new parents got to know the local green spaces, and they continued on with play groups out in the green space. There was also a green referrals program where GPs would identify patients with complex medical needs, so perhaps diabetes or depression or, you know, a cardiovascular risk, and they would refer them to outdoor physical activity programs, as in this photo here. I tend to take a little bit of a more informal approach myself. I like to think of people trying to get their green hour each day. So, as I mentioned before, you know, whether this might be just spending time outside on their way to and from work, or maybe at lunchtime getting out into the park. Some patients really just need me to suggest to them that it would be beneficial and outline some of the evidence for them. Others I might give a green prescription to, or still others maybe refer them on to a more sort of formal practice. It's still pretty new, the development of community programs that are nature-based in the city, in Melbourne, that's for sure. There are some great ideas coming from overseas. So this is a photo of Qing Li, who's the Japanese researcher who really done a lot of work on forest bathing, or Shinrin-yoku, which you may have heard of. So this is a program in Japan where certain forests are accredited for forest bathing. So they have to have a certain amount of forest cover. And doctors will refer patients with who are have high stress levels or high blood pressure, for example, to go and spend a certain amount of time in the forest, usually at least 2 hours. And in that time, they sort of walk very slowly and mindfully through the forest and just spend time sort of, I guess, taking it all in through their senses. And the studies that Qing Li's had have come up with the information around serum cortisol, blood pressure, beneficial effects, and also affecting our natural killer cells, which are important white blood cells in the body. There's also nature prescriptions, which are being used quite a lot overseas. I think we're a little bit of a laggard in this respect in Australia. So Robert Zar is a paediatrician based in the US who has a great program called Parks RX, which is the program I tend to use if I'm prescribing, giving a nature prescription for my patients. So it's just literally like another sort of script that a patient would get. So together the patient and I will talk about where they might like to go to be outside in nature. So it might be, they might like to sit in their backyard, or they might like to walk to the local park. Then it'll be, say maybe they might decide that they're going to go half an hour. And so it'll be a half an hour 3 times a week nature prescription. And they get a little reminder to make sure that they've been remembering to go. In New Zealand, they use a lot of green prescriptions, and the NHS also has a nature prescribing sort of program sitting under this. They call it social prescribing over there. So it includes other community interventions as well as time out in nature. So there's essentially a whole range of things that we can be suggesting for our patients. And so I thought I'd end with this Lunig again. So what are you doing? Well, I'm using my device. And what is your device? My device is the sky. And does it have many applications? Oh yes, it has sun, moon, clouds and birds. And do you have to recharge it very often? Well, I never have to recharge it because it recharges me. So I think that's kind of beautiful. And finally, I just put my a little bit about Doctors for the Environment there. So our vision is healthy planet, healthy people. And we are a not-for-profit independent organisation of doctors and medical students, really just trying to highlight these connections between health and our natural environment. So I hope you can check out our website. So we've got lots of resources and so forth you might enjoy looking at.
Thank you so much, Dimity. I'm just really struck by that beautiful simplicity of the concept of the green hour. And I mean, it's something that I know from my own experience that my own mental health and well-being is so much better when I've been able to get out into my garden for a little bit, or even just run away there when my children are driving me bonkers. So I think that's a beautiful, a beautiful, simple take-home message for everybody to think about, both in their own lives, but also in their practice for our health and educational professionals on the call tonight. I am going to bring in our community members in our conversation at this point. And while we've been really focused on that clinical side of things, I think we might actually start with Cherie. You've been working, I know, in therapeutic practice as a psychologist in a range of different environments, and I was wondering if you could tell us a little bit more about your journey in developing a nature-informed psychological practice, and perhaps as a starting point, if you can share a little bit about the Human Nature Adventure Therapy program.
Sure. Hi, everyone, and thanks to Dimity and Joe. They were fantastic, and just so many things to say and ask, and yeah, brilliant. I'm a psychologist, and I spent 3 years working in a program called the Recreate program through an organization called Human Nature Adventure Therapy. And up until now, the Recreate program was the primary program of the organization. So basically, excuse me, it's a 4-month program working with 14 to 19-year-old adolescents who are particularly vulnerable and disadvantaged. And it's a 4-month program, but the peak of the program is a 10-day bush adventure therapy expedition in nature. So it's half of it is walking, and the other half, the young women and young men are separate, and the young men, we do 5 days of canoeing out on the Clarence River, 3 hours west of the Byron Bay area. And then the girls program is up on Morgumpan country, up Moreton Bay. So we're up off Brisbane, and we're doing 5 days of hiking around an island and then 5 days of sailing around the bay. So it's a narrative therapy approach, and it's very much the kind of flow of the program is very much the physical is matching the therapeutic. So we're kind of building up in our therapeutic practice and also in our physical strenuousness in a similar way, building their connection to themselves, to each other, and to the natural world around them. And, you know, as the research that Dimity just talked about, there is a whole layer of therapeutic work that's happening by virtue of the fact that we're in nature doing this work. And it's a really carefully constructed program that's been developed over a decade now, that balances kind of 4 major programs. So bush adventure therapy programs in Australia are, there are a few different organisations running them. I'm sure some of you are quite aware of them. And the kind of 4 main mechanisms of change of those programs are adventure therapies, so using physically challenging and adventurous activities as well as using the physical body, and then the therapeutic frame. So the intentions and approaches used by skilled practitioners with, you know, building rapport and addressing some fairly severe presentations that we get from the participants, but doing it in the container of an environment where they're separate from their family home, which is often a lot of where the issues are arising or have arisen. And then, you know, also using small groups, use of the pro-social groups and safe, healthy relationships within that. And so we've got quite a high ratio of adults to participants, with the intention of creating this pro-social culture when you're otherwise engaging with a group of young people who may not have those behaviours because of what they've come through, and that's really kind of really being padded around them. And then obviously the natural environment. I could talk about human nature adventure therapy all day, but that's a little kind of outline. And that I continue to work, so I'm not working with that organisation anymore, but I continue to work with some of the young people bulk build outside of the program now, and we continue to go for walks in nature and walk down to the river, and that's how we do our sessions, because that's how we established it to begin with. So yeah.
Thanks, Sherry. And so now you're working more in private practice. How does nature-based work look and feel like for you and your clients in that sort of different setting?
Yeah, so I guess it really depends. You know, as I said, the participants from the programs, we just continue to do that work. Like, that's our norm. And you know, I think it's really important to say that a lot of people who find me because of the nature of the website and the nature of the work that I do, and just through associates, people are often coming to me who have sought kind of conventional therapy and don't, and it doesn't work for them for a variety of reasons. One of the reasons is they don't want to sit in four walls. You know, they've got enough experience or trauma being in clinical settings, and their capacity to actually sit with their own material within the container is something that doesn't feel good for them, is not there. So that one of the options is that we actually go for walks in nature as part of my work. And the great thing about that for psychologists out there, I'm not sure if everyone is aware, but there is actually a Medicare item number that provides Medicare rebates for out of office sessions. And those sessions are obviously dependent on the need of clients to basically not be able to benefit from in-room environments. But yeah, for a lot of my clients, that's why they're coming to me as well. So one of the options is being out of the office. And then, you know, touching on a lot of what Dimity has said, it's when we're out in nature, we're really using a lot of there is so much therapeutic material to be within nature, right? So I don't know, Sarah, if you want to kind of direct this a little bit more specifically, but some of the things that I find in terms of the therapeutic benefits, actually physically being in nature, doing the psychological work that I would be doing in the room, but outside, a big part of it is doing some of the work in real time. So we talk about mindfulness as a really important benefit of psychological practice these days, especially including CBT, and being and bringing in that mindfulness into our work is just so much easier actually in nature, because we're slowed right down. You know, we are, and I'm obviously modeling this, but we're doing it together of like, we're choosing where we want to go. We often take our shoes off if it's the right environment. We're feeling the floor, the ground beneath our feet. We're noticing the sounds of the birds. We're noticing the spider that's connected from one tree to another, you know, like we're just paying attention more. And then there's also like practical techniques that we can actually practice together, like mindful walking and feeling the leaves breaking underneath our feet. One of the things, I think, I can't remember which of you talked about it, but experiencing ourselves in the context of the world around us as well, you know, and this is a psychological idea of like remembering the contents of your thoughts in reference to other ways of thinking, or like cognitive restructuring, but we're actually doing that in a very physical sense. Like, we are humans in reference to the natural world around us. Like, we are having this conversation, and there are also these birds having a conversation in the tree, and sometimes right in the middle of a really big thing, there's just a pause because the birds are laughing in the tree, you know, and there are these kind of natural interjections into our work that are just so it's state changing, you know. We just remember our material in reference to what's around us as well. Movement, you know, movements of, you know, if we're in nature, we're often moving our body and often moving our emotional material at the same time as moving our physical body can be quite therapeutic and helpful, that momentum. And then there's kind of the deeper parts of like, you know, one of our biggest anxieties is our fear of the unknown. And sometimes when we're walking down a path in nature and we don't quite know where to go, we're kind of in the moment workshopping, what are we going to do now? Like, where are we going to go? And I don't know. Well, I don't know either. Oh, well, how do we make decisions? Oh, well, how do we engage with the possibility that down there there's, I don't know, a scary bird or a snake or something, you know, like I'm using extreme examples, but you know, there's some of that. So yeah, I could keep talking, but I think there's other people.
Thanks. I mean, I can see Catherine nodding along there, and I'd really love to invite her in, because I'm sure that a lot of what you're saying is really resonating with her and her experiences that she has teaching at the nature school and taking young people out into nature. I can also see, Rachel, your question for Cherie in the chat, and we might come back to that if that's okay, because we're going to have a section at the end today that we're actually going to ask everyone for their best tips. Catherine, would you like to just, I've got you on mute at the moment, can you unmute yourself perhaps, and maybe Jackie as well, and just respond to that beautiful description of working in nature that Cherie's just given us.
Cherie, I was just nodding along to everything you said then, because that is a picture of what school is like for us at the nature school. I mean, imagine a classroom that has no walls, that has no ceiling apart from the sky. Imagine what that does to a busy little brain. You know, it's just beautiful what we get to do at the nature school. I might just, can I screen share for one moment?
Yeah, we'd love to see some photos.
Let me see if I can make this work. So for those of you who don't know me, I'm the head of the Nature School Primary in Port Macquarie. And I've also got my colleague Jackie here, who may well jump in at any moment. Jackie is my right hand, who runs our early learning program for 0 to 3-year-old playgroup and 3 to 5-year-old bush immersion preschool program completely in the bush. So Jackie has no building whatsoever. She has 3 to 5-year-olds who spend all day, every day, regardless of the weather, in the bush. I run our primary school. So currently we cater for children in kindergarten to year 4. We're still a new little primary school growing year on year. By next year, I'll have about 80 students kindergarten to year 5. And one more year, we'll have around 100 students kindergarten to year 6 to get to experience this kind of education. And I just want to do something interactive, because I'm a teacher and you've all been very quiet this whole time. I shared this picture recently with some undergraduate students who are about to become teachers in Port Macquarie. And I showed them these 4 pictures and said, can anyone identify any of these things? And we don't really have time for a discussion, so I'll just go ahead and tell you. In the top left there, we have a mouse spider. On the top right, we have evidence of epicormic growth, recovery after the bushfires in Port Macquarie. In the bottom left, we have a species of black cockatoo called glossy black cockatoos. They're not actually red tails, they're glossy blacks. And in the bottom, we have a shark's egg. It's one of the bull shark species, quite possibly a Port Jackson bull shark. And I then asked these undergraduate teachers to tell me what these 4 pictures had in common. And they had a go and said things like, they're all black. And I was like, good job. And they're all things in nature. Double thumbs up. Someone even got to, are they all from the Port Macquarie area? Yes, fantastic. Someone pulled out the word endemic. And I said, brilliant. That is a word we use at the nature school. And then I said to them, you're all right. These things are all black, all from the natural world, all endemic to the Port Macquarie region. And they can all be correctly identified by 5-year-olds at the nature school, including the term epicormic growth, the correct identification of a glossy black cockatoo versus a red-tailed black cockatoo, and comparing a funnel web to a mouse spider. That's the kind of knowledge that children have about the natural world at my school. And they have it because, yes, some days we're in the classroom, but very often this is our classroom. And I love getting to share this photo because this was the day that Australian Geographic magazine came to visit the school. And I got to take a journalist and a photographer into the bush and show them what learning can look like for children. And this photo is not staged. I'm very certain that I'm pointing to a bird because I do a lot of that in the bush. And you can see how engaged these children are. I've got children writing and taking notes. I've got someone there with a pair of binoculars at the front. I've got eyes up trying to find the species that I'm identifying, and I've got children happy and engaged and learning in that kind of context, that kind of classroom. And the caption there says, nature-based schools are gaining momentum in Australia as more and more kids are swapping the classroom for the bush and proving that quality learning can take place in non-traditional settings. So it's my greatest privilege to get to teach like that after 20 years pretty much in mainstream schools. This for me is the dream job, and I love what I get to do. Jackie, do you want to share a bit about the early learning program?
Yeah, sure. Thank you. So like Kath said, I'm outdoors all day. So Monday to Thursday, I'm in the bush from 9 till 3 with 3 to 5 year olds. And on Friday, we do a 9 to 12 session for our younger guys. So as you can imagine, with no walls and no roof, it's quite unpredictable, but we're out there no matter what the weather. I mean, besides bushfires and electrical storms and extreme heat, we're out there. So if it's raining, we're building a tarp. The most common question we get is, what happens if it rains? And we say we get wet. It's just another sensory learning experience for the kids that are out there. So it's definitely a different learning environment, and one that I love, and because you get to see the different learning and development of the children that are out there, but also the adults, my staff, and the families as well, because our kids, even though some are just learning language when they come to us, they're going home and they're teaching their families about the species that they're seeing each day and about sustainability, and about our culture and community. So it's a pretty cool gig that we've got, I think.
And that level of engagement with the natural world from such a young age really changes our perspective. It changes their understanding of who they are and their place in the world. And I think that's really significant as we start to look at this crisis of mental health that we're having, particularly around the impact of climate change on children, young people and adults.
Yeah, I think that's so true, Catherine. In fact, I was just reading a paper just recently that was looking at people who'd survived the Black Saturday bushfires down in Victoria. And one of the findings of the paper was that they saw that people who identify themselves as having really strong connections with nature had an easier time in terms of their recovery. And I think that those strong connections in nature, like any other strong connections in our lives, are really best set up from early childhood, right? So giving our children opportunities to connect with nature becomes then really vitally important. I wonder as well about the sort of benefits that you guys are seeing in terms of the wellbeing for your staff members and for adult members of your community. Are there, is there mental health benefit for you and your teacher colleagues as well?
I love that phrase that I can't remember who said it, but I jotted it down, about recovering from mental fatigue. As the head of a busy little new primary school, I probably have a fair toll of mental fatigue, and I like nothing better than a day when I get to visit whichever class is off on adventure day down in the bushland near to our school, and I get to step out of the office and I can feel it start to ease and I step into the bushland. I had a kindergarten student who said to me recently, the bush is where dreams come true. That was her sense of what it feels like to step out of the classroom and walk into the bush. And, I literally feel as I start on that pathway down into the bush at the Inner Lake Nature Reserve, and the birds are really prolific at the start there at that fringe, kind of from the urban to the wild beyond space, I can actually feel the effect that it has on me physically and mentally. I can feel my breathing change. I can feel my heart rate drop. I can feel my brain start to strip away that real busyness and come down to what the really important things are that I have to do today. And every time I go through that process, I think, wow, not only is it working for me, but it must do something to my staff. And imagine what this is doing for our children. We used to have a society where children spent naturally heaps of time outside. They were up trees and in the mud and in the creek and, come home when you're called for dinner. We don't have that kind of society for kids anymore. We have kids connected to screens. We are those who are saying, let's get back to some of what was great about that, because we're losing a lot of that rich benefit of the connection between children and nature.
Yeah, thank you for that observation. I think it's really important. Andrew, I wonder if you'd like to join in the conversation as another educator on our panel tonight, and maybe share if you have similar experiences in your work that you're doing with Adventure Quest and your other programs.
Yeah, for sure. A lot of what everyone's been talking about's resonated pretty strongly with me, particularly the time in nature that everyone's been talking about. Our program is an adventure-based program, same as Cherie was talking about, and it's built around Joseph Campbell's hero's journey. So we go through a cycle of transformation, and the kids come on the program, they expect stuff to go wrong. They expect things to get hard. They expect to have to go through a crisis moment as a part of the program. So that's really cool. And I think it naturally embeds resilience into kids. Somebody mentioned, I think you just mentioned actually, identity and how that is an important part of mental health resilience. That's that process where the kids are getting to write their own story and position themselves as the hero in their own story. It's really fun, but it's also a really great way that I think to help equip them as adults going forward. We also embed in Dr. Roger Walsh's TLC, Therapeutic Lifestyle Choices. So if you look through the 8 of those, we cover all 8 of those in our program. And I was writing down some of the things that Joe was mentioning before that it really stuck out to me, you know, in the early slide that she put up there, the text that was there in green. You know, she talked about post-trauma growth and compassion. And for me, you know, working as a life coach, which is sort of comes out of the field of positive psychology, whenever you see those positive outcomes, you think, okay, what's going on for those outliers there? How are they? What are the key features of the people? How are they succeeding and overcoming when other people maybe aren't? And you know, some of those things down there, optimism, socially connected, learning from participation, they're all aspects of the program as well. So yeah, I'm just really resonating with everything that's being said here this evening.
Isn't that post-traumatic growth such an awesome one to use? I was thinking about that in light of the effect of the bushfires in Port Macquarie. And when we were planning for this, we talked about how that was a challenging situation because nature was both the problem, the challenge for us, but also inherently it was part of the solution as well. And that image of the epicormic growth, the way that you know, gum trees naturally recover, sort of gave us something to work with children to talk about their healthy recovery as well, their regrowth and their resilience as people. And also that conversation about giving us all something to do. So for us coming out of the bushfires, it was really important that we gave the children things that they could do in their community to make a difference as part of the regrowth. And for them, that was everything from, you know, writing thank you letters to the fireys who were just constantly overhead at our school because the fires came really close. But also, you know, monitoring the koala population. There's koalas at the Koala Hospital in Port Macquarie named after children at our school because they were involved in that, you know, so much baking for those who are looking after koalas. And now in the regrowth phase, the recovery phase, we're monitoring how quickly the koalas return. And, you know, 1 year on from the fires last week, we saw the first koala back in the school grounds at the nature school. And the kids were so excited to see how nature does bounce back and does recover, just as we do as people from traumatic situations. So I love that concept of post-traumatic growth.
I just interviewed this morning Tim Madron, who's you know, a local Port Macquarie guy, and he's put out just a new production talking about the Christmas bells, you know, that have just are now prolific, and they're another natural metaphor of how we can bounce back from challenging times. So it's on YouTube. You should go check it out. It's a great insight into the Port Macquarie community as well.
Brilliant.
Dimity or Joe, I wonder if you've got anything you'd like to jump in and share in terms of your reflections about how nature-based activity and work can really contribute to that mental health response to climate change impacts. Or Cherie?
Yeah, I want to pick up on something that Catherine said, that you know, where nature's both the problem and a sort of solution. And I think, you know, balancing those things is super important. And also that issue about, you know, action is an antidote to anxiety in some situations, and getting kids to work out what they can do. You know, I was at an event quite recently, and it was really helpful actually about thinking about not beating ourselves up constantly, which we do. You know, us humans, we're so bad, we're trashing the planet. You know, that kind of narrative is not particularly helpful. And thinking about what we can do, and it's okay to do what we can do, and, you know, to be response able was the phrase, which I think is actually really helpful. It's a really helpful way of thinking about things. And I think in terms of the post-traumatic growth, I think it is a really interesting area. And in the flood study that we did, we asked people about it specifically, and they were quite often able to identify a whole series of sort of positive things that had happened in terms of for them growing as a result of being involved in the flood. And there was a massive variety of that, but it was really interesting. Probably about 40% of respondents, and we had about 2,500 people take part in the community in that piece of research. And about 40% of them were able to actually write something about, you know, a positive post-traumatic growth aspect of being involved in the flood, which is really fascinating. And I don't think that gets very much airtime. You know, I think we talk a lot, don't we, about the really negative aspects and not very much about growth.
So true.
I was just going to chime in a little bit there too with the just reflecting around kids' experience of nature today in the city, because I have a background with the Kids in Nature Network over quite a long period of time with trying to promote the value of time in nature for kids. But one of the silver linings perhaps of the pandemic lockdown in Melbourne was, you know, all organised sport was cancelled. You know, there's no before or after school activities. All the playgrounds actually had like crime scene tape around them that you weren't allowed to go onto a playground equipment. So that actually meant that there was this whole generation of kids who kind of learned how to ride a bike, I think, and who were climbing trees, playing in the creek, you know, all these green spaces throughout even a city like Melbourne with, you know, millions of people. There were kids out in all these green spaces, and, you know, groups of kids riding their bikes together, playing outside together in the park, or parkland, I should say, sort of unsupervised. So that kind of old-fashioned idea of play that perhaps I experienced, that, you know, kids today really, I think there's been such a paucity for them to have the time or the space to be in nature. So their lives are often so highly scheduled, and also there's not so much green space that's accessible to them. But the pandemic lockdown here certainly, yeah, did open up that experience for them. So that was kind of a way in which nature kind of crept back into their lives, I think. So it was a really positive thing to see here.
And Dimity, I don't know if you know, but as a very avid bird nerd and bird watcher, the uptake of bird watching in Melbourne was off the charts. There have never been so many bird watchers, and BirdLife Australia recorded by far the most significant number of birds identified in the Aussie backyard bird count this year due to lockdown. So, you know, birding's done really well out of COVID.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely right. And I think I personally found, because there was a time where quite a long time, we were only allowed within 5 kilometres of our home. So, you know, everyone became very familiar with, well, I did, certainly many people, with any green space within 5 kilometres. And golf, there was no golf allowed to be played. So golf courses, you know, people just started walking in golf courses. And so a lot of golf courses here have actually got quite a lot of remnant bushland on them, and so have a lot of birds. So Yeah, so there were some lovely things like that. Certainly people out there and taking up bird watching. And with the Kids in Nature Network, we run Nature Play Week for the first sort of 12 days in April. And so this year we had to pivot and make, we couldn't have events outside. So we instead released each day of the week like an activity sheet, so parents could facilitate nature experiences close to home. And it was hugely popular. And the most popular thing was the backyard camp out. So we had, kids everywhere. And it's because we had to engage through social media, there was quite a big uptake globally with kids all around the world sort of getting out and connecting with the nature nearby to them. So, so there have been some really good things to come out of it from the childhood nature experience place. Yeah.
Absolutely. Now, I am mindful that time is just flying by, which I completely predicted, having spent at least an hour, I think, on the phone to all of our wonderful panelists. I wish I could have recorded those conversations as well, actually. Now, before we come back to having our panelists share with us a tip each for their for how either people can get more engaged with the mental health benefits of nature, or perhaps how psychologists or other clinicians or educators might be able to sort of bring nature into their work, I'd just like to do a little bit of housekeeping. So one of our team members is going to pop up the link to our evaluation form in the chat soon. And I just want to say, please, 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 everybody fill it in and help us make our events good for the future. And also for any GPs in the audience, to claim your CPD points, you are going to need to fill in that evaluation form so we can submit them to the college. And I'd also like to encourage people to follow us on Facebook and Insta for future events, and to get in touch if you'd like to get involved with our project. So we're always looking for more volunteers, and we've got some funding available to facilitate mentoring and future workshops. Now, back to the panel. While everyone's talking on the panel, if there are any of our wonderful attendees out there who'd like to share your best tips in the chat for connecting with nature for your own mental health and well-being. I should say as well, we're going to be sending out an email after this session to invite everybody to submit a video to our YouTube channel to share that more broadly as well. So get on board with that. So I'm going to start with my best tip. I've got a couple of them. You've already heard me talk about wanting to get out into my garden when I'm needing to take that, that moment of a couple of deep breaths to calm down and find my center and move on mindfully in life. But there's also some other really amazing community groups in our community here in the Hastings region. And I can see Deb's put community gardening in the chat, and I was going to recommend everybody to the Lost Plot, the Port Macquarie Community Gardens, which are our local community gardens and also our auspice organisation for Head, Heart and Hands. There's also some fantastic mental health support groups that work in nature. So there's Self-Seen, which runs, I think, a weekly walking session, one for men and one for women. And also there's One Wave. And I think One Wave is actually Australia-wide, and One Wave brings together people down at the beach. So it's probably not quite Australia-wide, it's probably just on the coast, brings together people down at the beach to provide peer support and mental health support to each other within the community. So anyone else on the panel want to share with us your best tip for getting out into nature or bringing nature into your clinical practice?
Oh, I've got so many. I'll pick three. I'll just pick two and talk quickly. One is in terms of climate crisis and the therapeutic nature of it. I just want to say, don't forget to grieve. Anytime there's the stress and tension and frustration and the rage of the way things used to be, or the way things I want to be, the way I want things to be, just don't forget to grieve. Go into that bit as well. It's a really key part to anything else, is to actually be with that bit first. And the second part is remembering, you know, in one of the major mental health supports is connection, and in that remembering that, like, we are the human form of nature. Like, we are part of nature, we are not separate from it, and remembering that the natural world is around us actually all the time, and getting out into nature is really important, but we are not excluded from the natural world. And that can be noticed in really small steps. And sure, walking on concrete isn't as great as walking on the earth, but it's as great as walking on the sand or whatever, but it's still there. And there are always bird sounds, as we talked about, and there are so many ways that we can remember that nature is our friend and our healer in, like, every moment.
Thank you, Cherie, for that beautiful advice. Andrew.
Yeah, I'd like to, you know, springboard off that, because I think it is such good advice. A lot of times when we think about climate change, we're always sort of painted as the bad guy, you know, that humankind is the villain in the story. But one thing that we do in our programs, but I think that everyone can do, is to see yourself as the hero in your own story. And we've started just a pilot program called Mini Heroes. It's for the younger kids, 5 to 9 year olds. And one of the things that I noticed was I put together some really good stuff, but the best part of their day, they check out with a highlight. The best part was when they just made up their game at the end of it. You know, it didn't matter how good my stuff was, their imaginative play at the end was the best bit. And I would encourage, you know, if I was to give a tip, you know, when you go out into the bush, you know, I mean, that's pretty common sense, just find a space and go out there. But kind of let your imagination go a little bit. Imagine that you are a little kid. Like, if you were a little kid walking through the bush, you know, there could be a dragon in the tree. There could be, you know, all sorts of amazing possibilities. Allow yourself to kind of awaken to those possibilities that you used to have when you were a kid. And I think you'd be surprised at how the wonder of nature can open up at that point. So that would be my tip.
Thank you so much, Andrew. I'm just going to randomly pick someone. Dimity, do you have anything you'd like to share with us before we finish up?
Yeah, I think, I really appreciate the not forgetting to grieve, because I think that's really crucial to stay with all the experience, not to kind of battle against pushing one part aside. But I think, yeah, that idea of trying to get your green hour and trying to think yourself how you're going to fit it in. Are you going to have breakfast outside? Are you going to go for a walk at lunchtime? Are you going to get outside at night and look at the stars? And also just this element of playfulness. It's not only kids who get to play, we can play too. And if you're going to go out into a local park, just that's maybe taking your shoes off so that you can get the grass between your toes, or lie on your back and try and see if you can see shapes in the clouds, or put your cheek up against a tree trunk, or your tummy. Just something a little bit out there, a little bit surprising and novel, that's engaging your senses in a different way. And I think that has a much more therapeutic benefit for you.
Thanks so much, Dimity. Jo?
Yeah, I'd really like, that's really helped me. There's just so many brilliant ideas here. There's heaps of things I wanted to say based on what everybody else has said. But one of the things I've started doing recently, I went to an amazing workshop run by Psychology for a Safe Climate, which was a fantastic space to be able to actually talk about how you felt and to grieve, and that grief and loss can, you know, grief and hope rather can, you know, they can happen at the same time. They're not mutually exclusive, right? You can do that work of grieving and have hope happening at the same time. And the resource, the nature resource we've got with each other, which is what Cherie was saying, I think is really key. But one thing subsequent to that I've been doing is I park my car away from work and I walk for 10 minutes to get into work. And I'm really trying to get to recognize and say hello, say good morning every morning to the trees that I walk past, because I'd not really noticed them before. And now I'm really noticing them, and I'm noticing every day oh, that looks slightly different today, or that's happening in that tree, or I feel like I'm getting to know them as entities, you know, rather than saying, oh yes, that's the silky oak and that's a, you know, a gum tree or whatever. It's not about that. It's about that individual tree that may have been there for 70 years and sort of relating to it in a completely different way, on a very personal way. And it's very mindful for me. It just helps me kind of get much more grounded at the beginning of the day.
Thank you, Jo. I think I'm going to have to try that tomorrow. That sounds wonderful. Catherine or Jackie?
I'd like to.
There you go.
Go for it.
Oh my gosh, yes, I'm not following you. I guess like I have a couple of different perspectives. Obviously, my first comes from the work with children that I do, and like Andrew said, it is as simple as getting out there. But I guess, what do you do once you're out there? You know, how do you take your children out and play? And something that we do is a little bit different, but you know, probably common amongst a lot of bush schools. It's not just about being out there; it's about how we practice and what we do, and that is giving our children the autonomy that we know that they're capable of. You know, we've got very capable 3 to 5 year olds, and sure, we're teaching them along the way. We're giving them boundaries and you know, different instructions to help keep themselves safe. But you know, a common theme that we've heard tonight is about developing resilience, and that's what these guys are doing. This, you know, being out in nature is the perfect environment to do that through risky play, building resilience. And so I guess getting out there with your children, if you have them, it's let them explore, let them climb the tree and make the mistake, skin their knee, have that experience and see the learning and the development that comes from that. I guess something as coming from an educator and an adult perspective, I'm in the bush half my week and the other half I'm in the office. And I put my office days in the middle of my week because I can feel the change, that physiological change in my body when I'm indoors and under lights and looking at a computer screen all day. And so usually I can do my couple of days and then get back out in the bush on Thursday. But some days I have to walk outside and take my shoes off and step on the ground and ground myself back in. And it's being aware of that and just knowing, like, I can't get out into the bush today, but this is the next best thing. And for some people, maybe it won't be an hour bushwalk. Maybe it'll be 5 minutes walking outside, hitting your garden, going for a little walk with your shoes off. Like it's relative to what everyone can do and is capable of. Yeah.
I'm glad you went first, Jackie, because that leads perfectly into what I was going to share, and I didn't even tell you. I think this is a really fantastic text. It's very accessible. It's not full of teacher jargon. It's our Vitamin N for Nature by Richard Louv, and the subheading is 500 Ways to Enrich the Health and Happiness of Your Family and Community. It's just a little pocket guide to 500 activities that you can do, and each one's just in a paragraph, so really useful for recommending to parents. But look, I am well known for turning any conversation into a birdwatching experience. So let's take a pair of binoculars outside, and this is Australia's best field guide. It's the CSIRO Australian Bird Guide. Why don't you just encourage people to head outside and see what they can see? That's the tip from me.
Are you getting commission, Catherine?
I couldn't have planned that finish.
To me. Maybe I'll have a chat about the nature school and a CSIRO bird guide.
So I just have to say thank you to our fabulous panel, and I hope you can all give them a beautiful virtual round of applause out there. So Catherine, thank you. Dimity, thank you. Jo, thank you. Jackie, thank you. Andrew, thank you. And Cherie, thank you. And not to forget our fantastic team behind the scenes as well. So Ali and Rachel, thank you so much for moderating the chat tonight. Thank you to all our wonderful attendees who've been contributing in the chat, to our project coordinator, Kate, and also, of course, to our fabulous supporting organisations without whom we would definitely not be here today. Nothing like having reporting responsibilities to actually get me doing my job. So the New South Wales Department of Primary Industry and the Environment, I think I got that right. Port Macquarie Hastings Sustainability Network, Port Macquarie Community Gardens, The Lost Plot. Thank you especially to DEA. I don't know if Kate's on the line tonight, but thank you for organising our CPD points for us. And we've also had support from Healthy North Coast, Mid North Coast Local Health District, Climate Change Australia, Charles Sturt University and Port Macquarie Hastings Council for this or other events. So thank you everybody for a marvellous night. Keep an eye out for your post-event emails for some information about how to get involved in our evaluation form. And we hope to see you again at another Head, Hearts and Hands event soon. Thank you. Good night.